Imagine a massive, sun-baked stone wall beside the dark waters of the Black Sea in the year 1346. Outside the wall, a vast army waits patiently on the grassy plain. Inside the city, wealthy merchants count their gold, their spices, and their fine silk. Neither group realizes that within a single year, an invisible enemy will destroy them both. And over the next 5 years, this unseen force will completely reshape the entire world. Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Today, we are undertaking a massive historical journey, tracking a timeline from 1347 to 1351. But we are doing something entirely unique. We are not just exploring the most devastating pandemic in human history. We are learning exactly how to tell its story. If you want an audience to remember your words, you need time-anchored storytelling. This means you must firmly attach or anchor your narrative to specific dates and precise locations. You need causal links. A causal link is the invisible bridge between cause and effect. It shows exactly why one historical event triggered another, so the viewer easily follows the spread. Throughout this 10-part journey, we will practice the English time markers, the smooth chronological transitions, and the powerful recap sentences used in high-retention documentaries. You will learn to hold an English-speaking audience in the palm of your hand. Let us set our historical baseline. A baseline is the normal state of affairs before a major disruption occurs. To establish this in English, historians often use the introductory time marker in the years leading up to. In the years leading up to 1346, the Eurasian continent was deeply and profitably connected. Vast trade networks, commonly known as the Silk Road, moved valuable goods from the distant east to the crowded shores of the Mediterranean Sea. Spices, heavy furs, and raw silk traveled thousands of miles on horseback and camel. But trade routes do not only carry luxury goods. They carry biological hitchhikers. Deep in the steppes of Central Asia, a microscopic bacterium called Yersinia pestis lived quietly among the local rodent populations. For decades, it remained relatively isolated. Let us look at the biological reality, because the microscopic world always mirrors the human world. Inside the stomach of a tiny flea, this bacterium multiplies rapidly. It forms a mass that completely blocks the flea's digestive tract. The infected flea begins to starve. Driven by frantic, desperate hunger, the aggressive insect bites any warm-blooded host it can find, regurgitating the deadly bacteria directly into the victim's bloodstream. This microscopic biological event is about to trigger a massive societal collapse. The chaos inside the bloodstream will soon become chaos in the city streets. We use the English transition phrase, meanwhile, to introduce a related event happening at the exact same time in a different location. Meanwhile, on the edge of the Crimean Peninsula, a crisis was brewing. Listen carefully for that phrase, a brewing crisis. In conversational English, when a crisis is brewing, it means tension is slowly and dangerously building, much like water boiling in a closed pot. The place is Caffa, known today as the city of Feodosia. In 1346, Caffa was a brilliant, wealthy trading colony. Controlled by the powerful Italian Republic of Genoa, it stood as a European fortress on the very edge of the Mongol Empire. But diplomatic relations had recently broken down. The Mongol army of the Golden Horde, led by a fierce commander named Johnny Beg, arrived. Outside the stone walls, they initiated a siege. When we say a military force initiates a siege, we mean they strategically surround a city, cutting off all food, water, and trade supplies until the trapped inhabitants surrender. For months, the Genoese merchants looked down from their high defensive walls at the sprawling leather tents of the Mongol army. The sea breeze was filled with the sounds of clashing armor, restless horses, and shouted military commands. Then, an accidental twist changed human history forever. A sudden, terrifying silence fell over the Mongol camp. The soldiers outside the walls were dying in massive numbers, but they were not dying from battle wounds or arrows. They were struck by a fierce, burning fever. Dark, agonizing swellings appeared on their necks and joints. The plague had reached the front lines. What happened next is one of the most famous and heavily debated moments in medieval history. To talk about uncertain history in academic English, we use cautious phrasing like, according to one contemporary account. A contemporary account is a written record created by a person who was actually alive during that exact time period. According to the Italian chronicler Gabriele de Musi, the dying Mongol army took a horrifying and desperate step. They loaded the infected corpses of their own soldiers onto large wooden catapults. With a heavy, echoing crash, they hurled the diseased bodies over the defensive walls of Caffa. Modern historians debate whether this was a deliberate early form of biological warfare, or if the infected rats simply crawled through the wooden gates on their own. As storytellers, we must use careful certainty. Evidence suggests that however the pathogen entered, the result was immediate and catastrophic. When we describe a sequence of rapid, devastating events, we use transitions of acceleration. Phrases like, shortly thereafter, or within a matter of weeks. Shortly thereafter, the sickness exploded within the crowded, terrified city. The narrow streets of Caffa, which normally smelled of fresh grain and sea salt, now carried the heavy, unmistakable stench of death. Here, we must establish our first major causal link. A causal link connects the why to the what. Because the city became an inescapable death trap, the surviving merchants made a desperate, panicked decision. Advanced English speakers often use the transition as a direct result to show a powerful, undeniable consequence. As a direct result of the catastrophic outbreak, the Genoese traders abandoned their lucrative trading posts. They loaded their remaining wealth onto galleys. A galley is a large, fast medieval ship propelled by long rowing oars and heavy cloth sails. In the darkness, coughing and deeply terrified, these merchants fled across the black waters. They truly believed they were leaving the nightmare behind them on the shore. They were entirely wrong. They carried the nightmare in their own blood, and deep in the dark, rat-infested holds of their wooden ships. Let us practice a mini recap. A mini recap summarizes the previous action to make absolutely sure the viewer perfectly follows the timeline. By late 1346, the plague had destroyed a vast Mongol army and successfully breached the walls of Caffa. Driven by pure survival instinct, a fleet of Genoese ships escaped onto the open water. The historical timeline is now moving. The causal chain is locked into motion. Where will the winter winds take these desperate ships? And what will happen to the bustling, entirely unprepared port cities of southern Europe when these ghost ships finally arrive? The disease is no longer isolated on the distant Asian steppes. It is on the water, and it is heading rapidly toward the heart of Europe. 12 wooden ships appeared on the horizon of the Mediterranean Sea in October 1347. For the people of Messina, a bustling port city on the island of Sicily, the arrival of these Genoese galleys should have been a moment of celebration and profit. Instead, it was the arrival of a silent, invisible killer that would alter the course of human history. The harbor was calm, the sun was warm, but as the ships drew closer, the waiting crowds realized something was terribly wrong. To tell this part of the story, we must master the art of the chronological transition. These are the English words and phrases that help your audience move through time without getting lost. In Part 1, we saw the plague escape the walls of Caffa. Now, in Part 10, we focus on the year 1347. In the early months of 1347, the plague was already moving through the major trade hubs of the Byzantine Empire. To move through a hub means to pass through a central point where many different routes meet. By May 1347, the disease had reached Constantinople, one of the greatest cities in the medieval world. The Byzantine Emperor, John VI Cantacuzene, watched in horror as his own son succumbed to the illness. To succumb to an illness is a formal way to say someone has died from a disease. In historical English, we use this phrase to add a sense of weight and tragedy to the narrative. Despite the devastation in Constantinople, the rest of Europe remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. This brings us to a crucial English storytelling technique: the use of dramatic irony. Dramatic irony occurs when the audience knows a catastrophe is coming, but the characters in the story do not. This creates a deep sense of tension. As the 12 Genoese galleys finally docked in the port of Messina in October 1347, the local Sicilians rushed to the water's edge. To dock a ship means to bring it into a harbor and tie it securely to the pier. But as the sailors threw their ropes, the townspeople gasped. Most of the men on board were already dead. Those who were still alive were shivering with high fevers and covered in mysterious, dark swellings. Listen for this specific historical term: buboes. A bubo is a painful, walnut-sized swelling of the lymph nodes, usually found in the neck, armpits, or groin. Because of these swellings, the disease became known as the bubonic plague. In 1347, people did not understand the biology of the infection. They did not know about bacteria or fleas. They saw these swellings as a divine punishment or a poisonous cloud in the air. When the people of Messina realized the danger, they acted with a mixture of fear and desperation. They quickly drove the ships back out to sea with arrows and fire. But the causal link had already been established. The moment those ships touched the wooden docks, the infection had jumped from the rats on the ships to the rats in the city. To jump from one host to another is a common way to describe how a virus or bacteria spreads. Now let us practice some time-anchored English phrases to describe the rapid spread. Phrases like "in the wake of" or "with lightning speed" help show the momentum of the story. In the wake of the ship's arrival, the city of Messina transformed into a graveyard. Within days, the sickness had spread from the harbor to the narrow, uphill streets. The people of Sicily, seeing their neighbors die in agony, fled into the countryside. However, as we have learned, fleeing often causes more harm than good in a pandemic. This is a recurring theme in our timeline. By trying to escape the death in the city, the refugees carried the plague into the rural villages of the interior. To carry a disease into an area is the English way of describing transmission. As 1347 drew to a close, the plague was no longer a distant rumor from the east. It was a terrifying reality on European soil. From Messina, the infection branched out like the roots of a dark tree. One branch moved toward the mainland of Italy, heading for the great city-states of Genoa and Venice. Another branch moved westward toward the coast of France. Let us look at a second causal link. Because the medieval world relied entirely on maritime trade that happens by sea, every major port was vulnerable. To be vulnerable means to be open to attack or harm. The very system that made Europe wealthy was now the system that would ensure its destruction. We must now recap the year 1347 to solidify our timeline. In the spring, the plague struck Constantinople. By October, it had reached Messina in Sicily. By the end of the year, the infection was firmly established in the Mediterranean, preparing to move into the heart of Western Europe. The story loop is now wide open. The year 1348 is approaching, and it will be the most violent year of the entire pandemic. How will the great inland cities like Florence and Paris react when they see the plague approaching their gates? Will their massive stone walls be enough to keep an invisible enemy at bay? And here is the idea loop for you to consider. In 1347, there was no such thing as a quarantine. The word did not even exist yet. How did people try to stop a killer they could not see? And what does their failure teach us about the importance of modern science? The Mediterranean was the front line, but the rest of the continent was about to be engulfed. As the calendar turned to 1348, the European continent stood on the precipice of a nightmare that no wall or prayer could prevent. We often imagine that a cold winter would slow down a biological enemy, but in the early months of 1348, the plague proved it was remarkably resilient. The frost did not kill the plague. It only masked its progress as it moved deeper into the heart of the West. Listen for our first major time marker of the year. By January 1348. By January 1348, the infected Genoese ships that had been chased away from Sicily found their way to the French port of Marseille. Marseille was a gateway to the rest of Europe, and its busy docks were the perfect environment for a contagion. In historical storytelling, we use the word gateway to describe a location that controls access to a much larger region. The scene in Marseille was one of sudden, sharp panic. Within weeks of the first ship docking, the city's mortality rate climbed to terrifying heights. In Marseille, the rate was so high that traditional funerals stopped entirely. The rhythmic tolling of church bells, which usually signaled a single death, eventually fell silent because there were simply too many bodies to count. From the coast, the plague followed a very specific geographic logic. It moved inland. The disease did not move randomly. It followed the great rivers of France, which served as the medieval version of high-speed highways. This brings us to a vital causal link in our timeline. Because the Rhone River was the primary trade artery of the region, the plague traveled north with incredible speed, reaching the city of Avignon by March 1348. At this moment in history, Avignon was not just any city. It was the residence of the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. This made Avignon the spiritual and political center of the Western world. When the plague reached the papal palace, it wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a global crisis of faith. Pope Clement VI found himself trapped in a city where his advisors and servants were dying in the hallways. Against all odds, the Pope survived, partly because his personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, realized that heat might keep the corrupt air away. The Pope sat between two massive, roaring fires in his private chambers for weeks, even during the heat of the summer. While this might seem strange, it likely worked because the intense heat kept the plague-carrying fleas away from his person. The plague was devastating the population. Moreover, it was destroying the very fabric of social order. In Avignon, the death toll was so massive that the Pope eventually had to consecrate the entire Rhone River. By doing this, the bodies could be thrown directly into the water and still be considered buried in holy ground. As we move through 1348, in April, the plague reached the city of Toulouse. By May, it had crossed the borders of Spain and entered the kingdom of Aragon. By June 1348, it had arrived at the gates of Paris. By the middle of 1348, the plague had traveled from the Mediterranean coast to the center of France, claiming the lives of thousands and forcing even the most powerful leaders of the church to hide behind walls of fire. The story loop here is focused on the urban centers. Paris was the largest city in northern Europe, a dense maze of wooden houses and narrow alleys. If the plague could bring the Pope to his knees in Avignon, what would it do to the crowded streets of the French capital? Notice how the timeline is accelerating. The gaps between the dates are getting shorter. This is because the disease is no longer relying on a few ships. It is now being carried by thousands of refugees fleeing from one city to the next. In historical English, we call this mass departure an exodus. An exodus is a situation where a large number of people leave a place at the same time. This exodus created a tragic paradox. The more people tried to run away from the death, the more they ensured the death would follow them. The causal link is clear. Human movement was the fuel for the fire. As we conclude Part 3, the plague is sitting on the edge of the English Channel. The year is still 1348, and the summer sun is shining. Across the narrow stretch of water lies the Kingdom of England. To the English, the French pox seemed like a distant problem. They believed the sea would protect them. They were wrong. In our next part, we will witness the moment the first infected sailor steps onto the soil of a small English fishing village, and we will see how the English language itself began to change as the world fell apart. For centuries, the people of the British Isles believed the English Channel was a natural fortress. They viewed the narrow stretch of gray, choppy water as a moat that protected them from the chaos of the European continent. But by the summer of 1348, that sense of security was about to vanish. To tell this chapter of the story, we must focus on the causal links between international trade and local disaster. In historical English, a causal link is the logic that explains how one event leads directly to another. On June 24th, 1348, a day traditionally celebrated as the feast of St. John the Baptist, a merchant ship from Gascony, France, dropped its anchor in the small port of Melcombe Regis, known today as Weymouth in Dorset. On the very day the people of Dorset were celebrating a religious holiday, the seeds of their destruction were being carried ashore. Because England was a major maritime power, its ports were constantly receiving goods from across the sea. The ship in Melcombe Regis carried fine French wine, but hidden in the layers of wool and grain were the same black rats that had devastated Marseille and Avignon. Here we see the accidental twist in our timeline. It was not a grand invasion of soldiers that conquered England. It was a single ship in a minor fishing village. As it turned out, the isolation of the English countryside would not save the people. Instead, their living conditions would make the spread even faster. In medieval England, most villagers lived in houses with thatched roofs. A thatched roof is a roof made of dried straw or reeds. While these roofs were excellent for keeping out the rain, they were the perfect breeding ground for rats. The rats lived in the straw, and the fleas lived on the rats. Consequently, the infection did not just stay in the ports. It moved directly into the bedrooms of the English peasantry. Because the housing was made of organic material, the spread was unstoppable. By August 1348, the sickness had moved through the county of Dorset and into neighboring Somerset. Within the span of 2 months, the Great Mortality, as the English called it, had reached the city of Bristol. Bristol was the second largest port in the kingdom, and its narrow, filthy streets were a paradise for the plague. As the plague moved north and east, a sense of dread began to paralyze the nation. This brings us to the emotional wave of our narrative. In the beginning, there was confusion. Then came the dread. Finally, there was the silent consequence. By the time autumn arrived, the traditional rhythm of English life had been shattered. One of the most tragic details of 1348 was the unharvested fields. Because so many laborers were dying, there was no one left to bring in the grain. To describe a situation where there are not enough people to do a job, we use the phrase, a labor shortage. Were left to rot. This created a secondary crisis, famine. Famine is a severe shortage of food that leads to widespread hunger. While the peasants were dying in their thatched huts, the wealthy elite in London still believed they were safe. While the plague was devouring the West Country, the royal court in London continued its business as if nothing were wrong. The timeline is anchored. June saw the arrival in Melcombe Regis. August saw the fall of Bristol. By September, the disease was knocking on the doors of London itself. London was the heart of the kingdom, a city of nearly 80,000 people packed into a very small space. If the plague could travel 100 miles through the countryside in just a few months, what would happen when it reached the most crowded square mile in the country? In 1348, the English authorities tried to blame the corrupt air coming from the south. They did not realize that their own trade routes, the very source of their wealth, were the veins through which the poison was flowing. As we move into Part 5, we will see London transform from a vibrant capital into a city of silence. We will explore how the English language developed new words to describe the mounting death tolls, and we will witness the moment the king's own daughter became a victim. The plague was no longer a visitor. It was the new master of the land. By November 1348, the great stone walls of London became the boundaries of a massive prison. The city was a dense maze of timber-framed houses, where the second stories often leaned out over the narrow, muddy streets. London was the most dense environment in England, and this was its greatest weakness. As winter approached in late 1348, the first cases of the pestilence appeared in the riverside tenements of Vintry Ward. A tenement is a room or a set of rooms forming a separate residence within a house or block of apartments, usually overcrowded and poorly maintained. The biological reality of London was a nightmare for hygiene. To use a contemporary English term, the sanitation of the city was non-existent. In 1348, open sewers ran down the middle of the streets, and the Thames River was a dumping ground for the city's refuse. Because of these conditions, the causal link was unavoidable. The rats did not just visit the city, they owned it. King Edward III was one of England's most powerful rulers, yet even he was helpless against the invisible enemy. In the summer of 1348, Joan was traveling to Spain to marry Prince Pedro of Castile. It was a high-stakes diplomatic marriage. But when her ship docked in Bordeaux, she was struck down by the plague. Listen for the specific phrase, struck down. The news of her death reached the king in October, just as the plague was entering London. It was a clear signal to the ruling class that no amount of gold or blue blood could provide immunity. As the situation in London worsened throughout the winter of 1348 and into early 1349, the city's infrastructure began to collapse. The most immediate failure was the burial system. The churchyards were full. The Bishop of London purchased a large plot of land outside the city walls called East Smithfield. This became one of the first emergency plague pits. Modern archaeologists have excavated this site, and their findings tell us something surprising about the medieval mind. Instead of finding bodies thrown in randomly, they found the victims laid out neatly in rows, side by side. Even in the face of total societal collapse, the people of London tried to maintain a sense of order and religious dignity. On a broader scale, we can see that the plague was not just killing people, it was killing the economy. As 1349 dawned, the shops were shuttered. The bustling markets of Cheapside fell silent. By late 1348, the plague had reached London's most crowded neighborhoods. By early 1349, the king had lost his daughter, and the city had opened its first mass burial pits. The timeline is now firmly anchored in the winter of 1349, the darkest hour for the English capital. If the plague killed nearly half the population of London, what happened to the buildings, the money, and the power that was left behind? Who would do the work when the work was dangerous and the workers were gone? The physical sickness of the body led directly to the political sickness of the state. When a government cannot protect its people from death, the people begin to question the government's right to rule. As we move into Part 6, we will see the plague move north toward the Scottish border. We will explore how the Scots reacted to the English sickness, and we will witness a surprising and accidental twist. The plague did not care about national borders or ancient grudges. It was about to prove that in a pandemic, everyone is a neighbor, whether they like it or not. While the bells of London fell silent in the spring of 1349, the people of northern England and Scotland watched the horizon with a mixture of terror and dark hope. To follow this timeline, we must shift our gaze from the crowded cities of the south to the rugged hills of the north. By the summer of 1349, the plague had reached the city of York. York was the capital of the north, a great religious and military center. As the disease tore through the city, the Scots, who had been at war with the English for decades, saw an opportunity. They believed the foul death of the English, as they called it, was a form of divine vengeance. The Scots believed God was finally punishing their ancient enemies. Because the Scots believed they were protected by God's favor, they gathered a massive army in the forest of Selkirk in early 1350. Their plan was simple. They would wait for the English to be weakened by the sickness, and then they would launch a devastating invasion. While the Scottish army waited in the forest, the very thing they were waiting for, the plague, was already moving among them. By gathering thousands of men in one place to prepare for war, they had created the perfect environment for a massive outbreak. To be susceptible means to be likely to be influenced or harmed by a particular thing. The crowded military camps, filled with men, horses, and grain supplies, were highly susceptible to an infestation of rats. Before the Scots could even cross the border, the plague struck. The Scottish soldiers panicked. Seeing their friends and commanders dying in agony, the army disintegrated. The survivors fled back to their homes in the Highlands and the Lowlands. But in their flight, they inadvertently carried the plague to every corner of Scotland. Inadvertently is a useful English adverb that means without intention or accidentally. By the end of 1350, Scotland was suffering just as much as England. By the autumn of 1350, the plague had completed its conquest of the British Isles. It had moved from the southern ports of Dorset, through the streets of London, across the northern plains of York, and deep into the mountains of Scotland. While the biological pathogen remained the same, the social reaction changed based on local culture. In England, the people turned to the law and the king. In Scotland, the people initially turned to military opportunism. In both cases, the result was a staggering death toll. When we describe a situation that has completely changed a landscape, we use the word desolation. Desolation describes a state of complete emptiness or destruction. By late 1350, many villages in northern England were scenes of total desolation. Entire families were gone. The fields were overgrown with weeds, and the livestock wandered aimlessly because there was no one left to tend them. Let's use a transition of summary to close this chapter. In summary, the year 1350 proved that the plague was a universal equalizer. It did not matter if you were English or Scottish, a king or a foot soldier. The causal chain of human interaction, whether through trade or war, ensured that the disease would find its way into every home. The Scots attempted to use the plague as a military advantage in 1350, but the plan backfired. Instead of conquering England, they brought the destruction back to their own families. By the end of the year, the entire island of Great Britain was in the grip of the pandemic. If the traditional structures of war and politics were failing, what would happen to the most powerful institution of all, the Church? As we enter 1351, we will see the rise of the flagellants, groups of people who traveled from town to town. These groups whipped themselves in public to appease God. When a society realizes its leaders cannot protect it from death, where does it turn for answers? In our next part, we will explore the radical religious movements that emerged from the shadows of the plague. The timeline is moving toward its final, most transformative stage. Blood began to stain the cobblestones of European town squares in the winter of 1350. It did not come from the plague. It came from the hands of the living. As the official structures of the church and the state struggled to explain why the world was ending, a radical new movement emerged from the shadows of the pandemic, reflecting the psychological collapse of society. In the midst of this chaos, thousands of people joined the ranks of the flagellants. A flagellant was a member of a religious sect that wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public as a form of penance. They believed the plague was a direct punishment from God for the sins of humanity. To stop the death, they felt they had to offer their own blood as a form of atonement. The arrival of a flagellant procession was a carefully choreographed spectacle, marching in groups of several hundred. Dressed in dark robes marked with red crosses, they reached a town square and formed a large circle. Then, at a given signal, they would stand and begin to beat their own backs with heavy leather whips tipped with metal spikes. The emotional wave moved from dread to a religious frenzy, a state of uncontrolled excitement or wild behavior. This was not just a private act of devotion. It was a public performance designed to shame the established clergy. Because the priests were dying just as fast as the peasants, many people lost faith in the church's ability to protect them. As the influence of the church weakened, the influence of radical, violent mobs grew. This leads us to one of the darkest chapters of the 1347 to 1351 timeline: the search for a scapegoat. A scapegoat is a person or group unfairly blamed for the suffering of others. In their desperation to find a human cause for the invisible bacteria, many communities turned against their neighbors. Specifically, the Jewish populations of Europe were falsely accused of poisoning the public wells. Driven by fear and misinformation, mobs in cities like Strasbourg and Mainz committed horrific acts of violence against innocent people. While some leaders, like Pope Clement VI, issued decrees to protect the Jewish communities. However, the speed of the panic was faster than the speed of the law. Evidence suggests that the Pope's attempts to stop the violence were largely ignored by the terrified public. In historical English, we describe this breakdown of authority as mob rule. Let us observe the biology to society mirror. The physical pathogen, Yersinia pestis, was attacking the biological body. Simultaneously, the social body was attacking itself. The pandemic had stripped away the thin layer of medieval civilization, revealing the raw fear beneath. As 1350 turned into 1351, the flagellant movement began to lose its momentum. Their failure to stop the plague through self-punishment led to a shift in public opinion. The tide began to turn when the authorities realized the flagellants were a threat to their own power. In 1351, the Pope officially condemned the movement as heresy. As we move into the final year of the Great Mortality, let us recap our timeline. By the end of 1350, the plague had caused not only a biological catastrophe, but a massive spiritual crisis. Radical groups like the flagellants had challenged the church, and thousands had died in the resulting social violence. If the old world was being torn apart by whips and fire, what kind of world would emerge from the ashes? The plague was finally starting to recede in the south, but it was moving into its final, most isolated frontier in the north. In 1351, the survivors began to look at their empty villages and realize something strange. The world was quiet. The labor was gone. The old rules of who was a master and who was a servant were starting to break. We will follow the final path of the plague as it moves into Scandinavia and the frozen north. We will witness the moment the pandemic officially burned itself out and explore how survivors negotiated a new, higher price for their lives. The timeline is reaching its conclusion, but the legacy of these 5 years is only just beginning. A lone wooden merchant ship drifted aimlessly into the deep, cold waters of the Bergen Fjord in the summer of 1349. On the shore, the people of Norway watched the vessel sway with the tide. There were no shouts from the deck. When the townspeople finally rowed out to investigate, they found a ghost ship. Every single member of the crew was dead. However, the true killers were still very much alive, hiding in the dark corners of the cargo hold. While the plague had moved through the dense cities of the south with terrifying speed, its journey into the north was slower and more deliberate. Norway and Sweden were remote, situated far from the main centers of population, but not unreachable. In the late summer of 1349, that single infected ship from England effectively imported the plague into Scandinavia. In this case, the product was death. Within months, the sickness had traveled from the port of Bergen to the capital of Oslo. The biological reality of the north was different from the Mediterranean. Because the population was more spread out, the plague often moved in fits and starts. However, once it reached a small, isolated village, the results were devastating. Because the Scandinavian climate was harsh and the growing seasons were short, the social structure was incredibly fragile. When the plague killed the young, strong farmers of a Norwegian valley, there was no one left to maintain the complex systems of mountain agriculture. As a direct result, entire communities did not just die from the sickness. They vanished from history because they could no longer feed themselves. Moving eastward, we see the infection cross the border into Sweden. By the spring of 1350, King Magnus IV of Sweden issued a desperate letter to his subjects, warning them that God was visiting his wrath upon the world. He ordered church attendance and charity. Despite the king's prayers, the plague's arrival in Stockholm was inevitable. From there, it crossed the Baltic Sea and reached the territories of the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League was a powerful medieval commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns. As the timeline reached 1351, the plague entered the city of Pskov, Russia. For years, the people of the East had heard rumors of a Great Mortality in the West. They believed they were safe because of the vast distances. But by 1351, the causal chain of trade had finally reached them. For the initial wave of the Black Death, Russia was the end of the line. In the city of Novgorod, the death toll was so high that the living could no longer keep up with the dead. The pathogen had traveled thousands of miles across mountains, seas, and forests, exploiting every human connection on the continent. But by 1351, it had run out of new populations to infect. The plague began to halt, not because it was defeated by medicine, but because it had literally run out of victims. Let's practice our mini recap for Part 8. By 1349, the plague reached Norway via a ghost ship. By 1350, it had devastated Sweden. And by 1351, it had reached the outskirts of Russia, completing its circuit of the known world. This recap allows us to see the big picture of the pandemic's geographical spread. The story loop for this part ends with a sense of eerie silence. In 1351, as the first wave of the pandemic finally began to subside, Europe looked like a different planet. To subside means to become less intense, violent, or severe. The streets were empty. The forests were reclaiming the farmland, and the voices of the nobility were suddenly much quieter. And here is the idea loop. If half the population is gone, what happens to the value of the survivors? In 1347, a peasant was considered a disposable tool. By 1351, a healthy laborer was the most valuable resource in the world. In our next part, we will explore the Great Leveling. We will see how the English language developed new ways to talk about rights, wages, and social class. We will witness the moment the survivors stopped being victims and started being rebels. The timeline of 1347 to 1351 is ending, but the revolution it sparked is just beginning. The silence that settled over Europe in the autumn of 1351 was unlike any the continent had ever known. It was not the peaceful silence of a sleeping village, but the heavy, ringing silence of a world that had lost nearly half of its voice. To understand this final phase of our 1347 to 1351 timeline, we must move away from the biology of the flea and focus on the biology of the economy. In English, we call the period immediately following a disaster the aftermath. Listen for that word, aftermath. It describes the complicated, often messy consequences that follow a great catastrophe. As 1351 drew to a close, the primary feeling among the survivors was not just relief, but a radical new sense of value. Let us look at a vivid scene from the English countryside. Imagine a manor lord, a wealthy landowner, standing on his stone balcony, looking out over hundreds of acres of golden wheat. In 1346, he had hundreds of serfs to harvest that wheat for almost no pay. A serf was a medieval laborer who was legally bound to work on a lord's estate. But in the winter of 1351, he looks out and sees only 3 or 4 healthy men. Here we see the most significant causal link of the entire pandemic. Because there was a massive scarcity of labor, the surviving workers realized they held a powerful new weapon. Scarcity is a formal English term for a state of being in short supply. In modern English, we might say the workers now had leverage. Leverage is the power to influence a person or a situation to get what you want. For the first time in centuries, the peasants began to negotiate. To negotiate means to try to reach an agreement or compromise through discussion. They told the lords, "If you do not double our wages and provide us with better food, we will walk away and find another lord who will." In the years leading up to 1347, such a statement would have been considered treason. In 1351, it was a simple matter of supply and demand. However, the ruling class did not accept this shift quietly. This brings us to a major pattern interrupt in our timeline: the birth of modern labor laws. In June 1351, the English Parliament passed a famous law called the Statute of Labourers. A statute is a written law passed by a legislative body. This law was a desperate attempt by the elites to freeze time. It commanded that all wages be returned to the levels they were at in 1346, before the plague began. It also made it a crime for a laborer to leave his village in search of better pay. Listen for this repeatable phrase: the law of the land. In historical English, we use this phrase to describe a rule that everyone is expected to follow, regardless of their status. But the Statute of Labourers failed. It failed because the economic reality was stronger than the king's ink. The lords needed their crops harvested, and they were willing to pay higher wages in secret just to survive. Let's look at the biology to society mirror here. The plague had killed the people, but it had left the physical wealth of Europe, the houses, the gold, the tools, and the land, completely intact. This created an unprecedented accumulation of wealth for the survivors. Unprecedented is a high-level English adjective that means never done or known before. A peasant who survived 1351 might suddenly inherit the clothing, the pots, and the small savings of 4 or 5 dead relatives. Their standard of living, the degree of wealth and comfort they enjoyed, suddenly spiked. As we use our English time markers to wrap up the year 1351, we see a fascinating transition in the English language itself. Before the plague, French was the language of the ruling elite in England, while the common people spoke a form of English. But because so many French-speaking teachers and priests died during the pandemic, the English language began to flood back into the schools and the courts. The plague accidentally helped the English language become the dominant voice of the nation. Now, let us practice a mini recap of Part 9. By late 1351, the biological pandemic was receding. But the economic revolution was just starting. The Statute of Laborers tried to force the world back to 1346. But the scarcity of workers gave the common people unprecedented leverage. The old social order was crumbling, and a new, wealthier middle class was beginning to emerge from the aftermath. The story loop for this part ends with a looming conflict. The lords were angry, the peasants were empowered, and the church was struggling to explain why a good God would allow such horror. The year 1351 was not the end of the story. It was the birth of a new kind of tension that would eventually lead to the Great Peasants' Revolt. And here is the idea loop. If a pandemic can change the way we speak, the way we work, and the way we value human life, was the Black Death a purely negative event? Or was it the brutal, painful reset button that the medieval world needed to move toward the modern age? Or was it the brutal, painful reset button that the medieval world needed to move toward the modern age? In our final part, we will look back at the entire 1347 to 1351 timeline. We will analyze the lasting causal links that still affect our world today. We will see how the memory of the Great Mortality was anchored into the songs, the stories, and the architecture of Europe. The journey is nearly complete, and the final lesson is about to be revealed. The year 1351 did not arrive with a celebration or a grand proclamation of victory. There were no parades to mark the end of the Great Mortality. Instead, the year 1351 was characterized by a quiet, cautious realization that the worst of the storm had finally passed. To conclude our 5-year timeline, we must look at the legacy of this era. In English, a legacy is something that is handed down from the past, often a lasting impact or a permanent change left behind by a person or an event. To summarize our journey from 1347 to 1351, let us use the English phrase, in retrospect. In retrospect means looking back on past events with the benefit of current knowledge. In retrospect, these 5 years were a watershed moment in human history. A watershed moment is a turning point. an event that marks a unique and important change in direction. Before 1347, Europe was a rigid, overpopulated society trapped in a system of feudalism. By late 1351, that system was in ruins, and the seeds of the modern world were beginning to sprout. Listen for our final time-anchored storytelling recap. In 1347, the invisible killer arrived at the gates of Caffa and the docks of Sicily. Throughout 1348, it devoured the great cities of France and England, reaching the halls of the Pope and the palace of the king. In 1349 and 1350, it conquered the remote valleys of Scandinavia and the mountain passes of Scotland. And finally, by 1351, it had reached the Russian plains, completing its circuit. Before the pathogen began to lose its initial, terrifying momentum. This timeline teaches us about causal links on a global scale. Because the population was so drastically reduced, the environment itself began to change. In historical English, we describe this as reforestation. Thousands of acres of former farmland were abandoned and quickly reclaimed by forests. This led to a temporary cooling of the climate and a surge in wildlife. The biology to society mirror shows us that when humans suffer, the earth often finds a strange, silent way to heal. Now, let us observe the English language once more. In the years following 1351, English literature underwent a dramatic transformation. Because so many Latin-speaking scholars had perished, the English language became the primary tool for recording the new reality. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, who was a child during the 1348 outbreak in London, would go on to write in the common tongue of the people. This transition, from the language of the elite to the language of the survivor, is the reason we are speaking this version of English today. To describe how a society remembers a tragedy, we use the term collective memory. The collective memory of 1347 to 1351 was anchored in the very architecture of Europe. You can still see this today in many English churches. After 1351, the elaborate, expensive styles of building were replaced by a simpler, more efficient style called Perpendicular Gothic. It was a style born of necessity, created by a society that had fewer stonemasons and less money, but a greater sense of resilience. Listen for that word, resilience. In English, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. The survivors of 1351 were perhaps the most resilient generation in history. They had watched their world collapse, yet they did not give up. They negotiated for better lives, they rebuilt their villages, and they created a new economy based on the value of the individual rather than the power of the Lord. Let us practice a final mini recap of the entire documentary series. We have tracked a pathogen from a Mongol siege to the frozen fjords of Norway. We have seen how trade routes became death traps and how a labor shortage became a revolution. We have learned that history is not just a list of dates, but a chain of causes and effects that shape the way we live now. The story loop of the Black Death does not truly end in 1351. The plague would return every few decades for the next 300 years, but it would never again find a world so unprepared or a society so fragile. The people of 1351 had learned the hard lessons of sanitation, quarantine, and social value. And here is the final idea loop for you, the learner. Why do we still tell this story nearly 700 years later? We tell it because the 1347 to 1351 timeline is the ultimate story of human adaptation. It reminds us that even when the world seems to be ending, the survivors are already building the foundation for what comes next. By learning these time markers, these transitions, and these causal links, you are not just learning a language. You're learning how to frame the most important stories of our shared human experience. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the London Gritty Chronicles. You now have the tools to tell a story that anchors your audience in time and helps them see the hidden connections between the past and the present. The timeline is complete. The lesson is yours to keep, and the world of 1351 is finally at rest.